Hi there, this is Phil with PhilFX, and we've got another tutorial. Today, this is going to be really a very brief introduction to compositing, and in particular using two different layer compositors and comparing them to two different node compositors. And we've been working a little bit in Maya using render layers in Maya 2016, and we haven't talked nor have we used the render passes. That's going to be for another subject later on, but this really is just going over render layers. So I've got a Maya scene that I've set up, and you can see that I've set up a number of render layers. There's the master layer here. I've set the scene up with Ambient Occlusion, and in Ambient Occlusion I'm going in and created the override layer for using the MIB material. So we can set up with a ambient occlusion. If we go ahead and take a look at this, I can open this up and load this up, and so we can see what the AO layer looks like. And let me take this over, and we can zoom this up just a little bit so you can see the shader. So what I'm using for ambient occlusion, we've got an MIB, ambient occlusion layer. We feed that into a surface shader, and if we go from the out value into the out color of a surface shader, and then we just apply that to the material. And you can see in the material viewer what the AO looks like. Yeah, you can look at the parameters just a little bit. The default on the sampling comes out to be 16. I increased that to 32, and I increased the spread just a little bit. But other than that, it's pretty much just what the default settings are. So that's how we're doing ambient occlusion. Again, the way that this is done, it's applied to all of the items, all of the objects in the scene, and it's done as a material override. So only on this layer do we have a override at this point. I have a diffuse light layer, and that's where I have all the objects in here. And if we go in and I open up the outliner here, we can take a look, and if we look at my spotlights and we see their attributes, you can see on this layer those spotlights are only emitting diffuse light. They're not emitting specular light. Okay, so that's how I'm accomplishing that. We've got a specular light layer, and if we go there and look at the attributes, there you can see diffuse has been turned off, and the lights now emit specular light. Okay. And going through here, I've got an IBL layer where I only see lighting from my image-based lighting. And in that particular layer, if we look at the membership of who's in there, and you can see membership, remember, by right-clicking and going down here, and let's see membership. And so you can see the relationship editor is called up. And we can go in here and we can look at the scene in IBL, and when we're rendering with image-based lighting, we have the spotlights are not included in that layer. So we have all the materials, but we just include the image-based lighting. Likewise, if we go in and we look at diffuse light, notice the spotlights are included, but the image-based lighting is not. So when we do the renders for the under diffuse light, we don't get any contribution from the image-based lighting. So we render all this out, and one of the things that render layers does for us very nicely is when everything renders out, and remember, when you render layers, you need to use batch render. So you go in, and when you render, everybody's used to in class going in, and you just have the render view for the scene, and you just render one picture of what your scene looks like. Well, that's not how you want to render out render layers. You want to go in and you want to set your menu to the rendering menu, and you want to go up to render, and you want to go down here and use batch render. And we can click the box to see the options. but for everything that we're doing in class, you can just leave the defaults here the way they are. And so you can just click back to render and close, or actually you can just go to the render tab and just hit batch render right here. And that will render your outputs in batch mode. Now when you do that, if we look at the images folder, and you've all set up your project folders correctly, you get a folder. Maya sets up a folder for each one of the render layers. So I have scene objects AO, and we have scene objects AO. So we see that layer here, and I have a folder for scene objects and diffuse light, scene objects and diffuse light, scene objects IVL, object mask, specular light, and so on and so forth. So we get a folder set up for each one of those. And then depending upon my render settings, so if we go in here and look at the render settings, currently the way I have things set, I've got things for rendering out a PNG. And if I look at my quality and I look at my frame buffer, this is for a 16-bit. So this is for a large PNG, is what I rendered out. And if I go in and we look at inside one of these folders, we can see actually I rendered out a number of different kind of outputs. I rendered a, I call it a different name. I rendered out an 8-bit PNG. So this is an 8-bit ping. I rendered out, big ping is a 16-bit PNG, and I rendered out a floating point HDR. So this is a high dynamic range image. If we look at each one of these, you can see I've done that for each one of these, okay? So I did an 8-bit, a 16-bit ping, and a floating point. So now that we've rendered our outputs, we want to compose this together. And there's a number of ways you can compose, and I'm going to show 4. The first 2 ways are with layer-based editors that probably most people are most familiar with. Excuse me. So let me call up Photoshop here. And what I've done is I opened up actually the very first layer, which was the diffuse layer, and I made that my bottom layer. Then I went in, and you can see the link signs over here. What I did is I went in and I did a file place linked, and I grabbed each one of those files and I placed them linked, and I put in the specular on top of the diffuse, and I put the I'm calling it GI global illumination. This was the image-based lighting, and then the ambient occlusion I put on top. And if we go in here and I selectively turn off each of these layers, you can see this is the base diffuse that I brought in, all right? And right now, let's check the mode. I can see which one do I have. Okay, yeah, these are the 8-bit RGB images that I brought in. So this is the 8 bits per channel, and this is RGB. So these are the small 8-bit files that I brought in. And we look at the diffuse, and then we want to put the specular on top. Now here's where you have to get into your blending modes. So if we put the specular on top and I enable this, if we go up here, we can see I'm doing a screen to add the specular to the diffuse. Now screening isn't exactly the same as doing a layer add. To be technically correct, if I was using a linear workflow, in other words, if I was working with floating point files, I really probably wouldn't want to use a screen. I would use what's called a linear dodge. And a linear dodge does exactly the add. But we're getting things blown out here. And the reason we're getting things blown out is the files that we're working with have not been gamma corrected. So these are 8-bit images on non-gamma corrected files, and so actually using a linear dodge causes the specular, in this case, to be quite blown out. And so when you're working with 8-bit files that have not been gamma corrected, doing a screen when you do that add is actually a little more effective and gives more realistic results. We can go in and then add our image-based lighting, And I turn that on, and you can see how the background comes in and brings things out. And then the last thing, and you can see, okay, I screen that to the layer below. If we take the specular, it's screened to the layer below. And then the last thing is my ambient occlusion. And so I bring in ambient occlusion, and let me turn off the other layers so we look at that. And ambient occlusion really is for enhancing the shadows where objects are spatially close to one another. It really has nothing to do with shadows. What it does is well, in the sense of shadows from lighting, okay? When you render out an ambient occlusion layer, there's actually no lights at all on that layer. You're not interested in shadows being produced from lighting. You get shadows that are produced because objects are, their proximity to one another is very close, and that's what causes the darkening. And if we look at this, every place that's bright is essentially the value of 1 because it's white. And as things get darker and darker, these values get closer and closer to 0. And the way that you combine ambient occlusion onto all of your lower layers is you don't screen, but you multiply, all right? And so what that does is it does it essentially where it's 1, it leaves everything alone. And where it's less than 1, you get a slight darkening of those particular regions. So if we turn all these other layers back on, and let me turn this on and off, you can see that darkening. And so there's a fair amount of darkening that's quite visible underneath the pot and in between these slats on this particular piece of furniture. So you can see how that ambient occlusion works to darken that image. And what we end up with this then is our final image. So we brought in all those layers. We've put one on top of each other. We use a screen blending mode in Photoshop to add one on top of the other, and then the last layer that we add is our ambient occlusion, and the ambient occlusion we multiply. And this order is in fact the order that you want. You want the ambient occlusion on top, and you want everything else underneath it. And you want the ambient occlusion multiplying everything down. Now that is one thing that is different in layer compositors versus node compositors. In layer compositors, this is where layer compositors tend to be very quick to set up, and for a simple scene, you can get things going really fast. Just bring in 4 layers, boom, 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 you got it all set up, and the whole thing is composited. And it doesn't get much simpler than that. The difficulty is when you want to start putting effects on a specific layer. In layer compositing, it becomes difficult because anything you do to one layer without doing something different like creating groups or in After Effects creating pre-compositions, what you do on this layer affects everything below it. And in fact, maybe you only want to do an effect on the ambient occlusion and you don't want it to affect all these other layers. Well, it becomes a little bit more convoluted to go ahead and do that. It's not impossible. You absolutely can do it, but it becomes a little more difficult because when you have layer-based compositing, everything you do on one layer affects everything below it. So we looked at Photoshop. Let's go in here and we'll look at After Effects. In After Effects, I get the same results. Let me bring up my Photoshop and we can put those side by side. And you can, let me scale this a little bit so it's a little bit easier to see. But you can see that our results are essentially the same. Here, if I can get this to scale over, bring that up, get that close to that, there. So you can see the two. Here we've composited with After Effects, and here I've composited in Photoshop, and the results are essentially the same, as you would expect them to be. And in compositing things in After Effects, I brought layers in, and so I have my diffuse light. This particular example is using the 16-bit PNGs, not the 8-bit. And so I bring in the diffuse and I put that on the bottom. Let me turn off the other layers. So here's my diffuse, and it comes in on the bottom, and because it's not combining with anything, the blending mode is just normal. I bring in the specular, and I do a screen. Again, these are 8-bit, or these are 16-bit images, but they're still not linear. And so you want to use a screen and not a linear dodge. I can use a linear dodge, but if I go in here and do that, you can see this gets blown out. And again, that's because these images are not gamma corrected, all right? If I went in and I did a gamma correction on all of the 8-bit images, then I could actually use the linear dodge and the color would end up looking like this. But that gets very convoluted, and you really don't need to do that. Again, if you're working with 8-bit images, you just use screen instead of linear dodge. So here's our global illumination, or image-based lighting rather. Add that in. This lights up in the background. And we add our ambient occlusion in last. And like I said before, the blending mode on that is a multiply. And I can turn that on and off. And again, we see the effects of that ambient occlusion on these layers. So this was compositing with Photoshop and compositing with After Effects. The last two ways that I want to do this is I want to go in, and there are two main compositing programs that virtually the whole industry uses that are node-based compositors. Well, there's actually a third. If you have Blender, Blender actually has a node-based compositor inside. In terms of major production houses, I think it's fairly safe to say that it's probably not used too much. I'm not going to say it's not used at all. But in general, you're going to find that most professional studios use either Fusion, which is from Blackmagic. It used to be from Eon Systems. Eon was bought by Blackmagic, I believe, a couple years ago. And they have this product called Fusion, which is a very excellent node-based compositor. And then there is the Foundry, and this is the 800-pound gorilla, and they have Nuke. And I have both, and I use both. I've been using Nuke actually for quite a while, and just started learning how to use Fusion. But they're both excellent compositors. They both have free versions. Pardon me. If you go to the Blackmagic website, you can get Fusion 8, and if you click, you can download. You can get it for OS 10, and you can get it for Windows. Fusion 7, they have it for Windows. And you can download these and install them. And there is some training available here on the Blackmagic website. And again, there's various YouTube channels and Vimeo channels on the web for training, both on Fusion and for Nuke. I have no training at the moment for either of those, but I will in the future. But at the moment, I don't. So you download and install. For Nuke, they have a non-commercial learning edition. And if you go to this website that you see up here, Foundry UK Products, Nuke Non-Commercial Register, you do have to register and sign in, but then once you do that and sign in, you can download and use the non-commercial version. The one big difference, though, between the Foundry's non-commercial and Fusion's free version is you can use the free version of Fusion for commercial purposes. The biggest difference between the paid version of Fusion and the free version of Fusion has to do mostly with network rendering. With the free version, you don't get network rendering. And if you're just a freelance person working by yourself, that's 9 times out of 10, that's not an issue. If you're a big studio, that's a big issue. And your big studios are going to want to use network rendering, and so they're going to want the paid version of Fusion. If you go to the Foundry and you get the non-commercial version under the license as it is, you can't use this for commercial purposes. You can certainly use it for learning. We certainly use it in class. So you can download this and install it. And in terms of restrictions, there's not too many restrictions in the non-commercial version of Nuke. There's a few things having to do with deep compositing and with some of the sizes, but beyond that, it's pretty much the same as the full-blown version. Same kind of thing. The Foundry has some training and some tutorials on their website, and likewise, if you go on to YouTube channel And for the Foundry, there's plenty of training and tutorials on both those programs. So let's go ahead and get started. So if I open up Fusion, let me hit save here first, and we'll just create a new blank page. So when you open up the user interface on Fusion, you have a area down here where you compose your nodes and you put things together, and you have a couple of viewing panels, and you have a panel over here that describes the attributes of a particular node that you're going to do. And you can change how this looks. If you go over here, you can change the setup. So I have one screen, or I can have two screens. So I can change how this appears. This particular setup where I have two views, a work panel, and my attributes over here is the way that I prefer to work. Makes things convenient. I can see, an input or an output or something in one node and then something on another node down the road. So it's a lot more convenient. So let's go back to our comp here. One of the things you want to do when you create a new composition, one of the first things you want to do is you want to go up to Preferences. And when you go into Preferences, you'll see Global Settings and Default Settings. And then you'll see the settings for your scene. And the one things you first want to do is you want to set the frame format. This sets the height and width of the frames that you're working with. So whenever you create a new node, Fusion is going to assume that the size of that node, the input is going to be, in this case, 960 pixels in width by 540 pixels in height. If you don't set this, it'll go to a default value, and that may or may not be what you want. And you will have to go back in, and you may end up seeing some strange results where you see an image and then you see that there's a big outline. And the reason for the outline is you can look right up here and you'll see that, well, it's doing, a 2K image or a 4K image, and my original size of my riddle image was just 960 by 540. And so the reason for the difference is you didn't go in and you didn't set your frame format. So you want to set that frame format so then everything is the same size all the way through. So the first thing you do in a nodal compositor is you want to bring your images in. And the way you do that in Fusion is you use a load node. So right here, the very first one on the top, where you can go to Tools, and you go to I/O, and there's a loader. Or we go over here, we just click this LD, and that brings in, it's asking me, I clicked it and it says, okay, what node do I want to bring in? All right, and I can go in and I can grab a node. This, in fact, is not, let's see, go over here, here, to here. Under Images, IBL, I can grab this node. So this is one of the nodes from our scene, and I can just say Open, okay? And this is that node right there, okay? This is what it creates. Notice that there isn't an icon picture at the moment. I can go in, and I'm not viewing what this picture is. Well, the way you view this is, I have two viewers here, 1 and 2, which is left and right. If I click on this and I hit 1, this is the image right there. If I have this clicked on and I hit 2, I have the same thing. Notice both of these little dots here lit up. So this is 1 and this is 2. You will notice also that these images look different. The reason that they look different is because of the lookup tables. And this is showing the raw image ungamma corrected, and this is showing the image using gamma correction. And because it's a JPEG image or it's a PNG image, this shows what the image looks like with the gamma correction inside. This shows what it would look like with the gamma correction removed. If I turn this off, so I'm not using the lookup table, then we have the image on the right looks the same as the image on the left. So let's go in and I don't need that node, so I'm just going to hit the delete key and delete that. Go back over here, hit 1, and we can walk through. One thing you can see here is this is my scene. I've got this kind of preview over here, so I can position this a little bit better. All right. If I want to zoom in or zoom out on Fusion, if I hold down the command key and then scroll with my mouse, okay, I can zoom in or zoom out. If I click down with the, I'm using the middle mouse button to scroll. If I click and drag, I get the hand. And so we can look right here. Okay. Now, for me to work with these images and work with them in Fusion, I did need to do a gamma correction. Okay. So it turns out with Nuke, I didn't need to do a gamma correction. With Fusion, I did. And so I brought the image in. So here's my initial image coming in, and we can see that this image is an 8-bit. If I hold the mouse over it, we can see the details on the file. So we can see that the depth is 8 bits, so this is an 8-bit image. We can see the size, 960 by 540. And I'm going to go down here and I am going to do what's called a merge. So I take the output of this file and I want to merge it. But the first thing I need to do is I need to correct that gamma. Okay, so if I go in and let's look at this output of this gamma correction node. So all I did is I clicked on this and I clicked on number 2, which shows it over here. And you can see the dot here. So I click back on this. This dot's lit up, that means it's in viewer 1. I click over here, I hit number 2. This is shown in viewer number 2. This is where it's nice to have these 2 viewers so you can see an input and an output. So this is my original file that gets loaded. I bring it in and I need to gamma correct it. So I go in and I gamma correct it, and I use the gamma correction node. And you can see, if I click over here, we can see here's the gamma correction node. I bring it in, and the source space is sRGB, but I want to remove the gamma. All right, so that's what I'm doing. So I click on here to remove the gamma. If I take that off, say don't remove the gamma, the output looks the same as the input. I want to remove that gamma. So I click on here to remove the gamma, and so I remove the gamma correction. And now I'm going to use that for compositing. We go down here, this is my next scene, my next input, and the file that I'm bringing in here, this is specular. So this was my specular lighting. Same kind of thing, I want to go in and I want to gamma correct that. And so if I click on this and hit 2, this is the gamma corrected. There isn't a whole lot of difference. You can see there's some slight darkening. Okay, so we darken that. And so now I'm going to use a merge node. And by using gamma correction, I know that gets a little confusing, but because I have gamma corrected things, now when I do my merge, my blending mode is normal. All right, this gives me the right kind of operation that I want to use. Notice I do have screen, I have dodge and everything else, but it turns out that in Fusion, if you have gamma corrected your 8-bit files, then using normal mode for blending mode is exactly what you want. So then if we hold down Control and I go down here, we bring in, this was my image-based lighting. So this is my image-based lighting. This is my image-based lighting gamma corrected. Now this, if I look at this node, this is image-based lighting blended normally with the specular. And so what we have up here is this was the diffuse, this was the specular. I blended those two together in a node. I took the output of that node, I brought in my image-based lighting, I gamma corrected it, I blended that using normal mode. I take the output of that, and now here I have my ambient occlusion node. And it turns out you do want to gamma correct that because the midtones are a little bit too bright, and so you do want to gamma correct your AO. If I take this and put this on 2, put this on 1, you can see the difference between the two. There is a difference, okay? It's a little bit darker. And I found this out actually by going in and looking at things of Fusion versus Nuke. To me, Nuke is the gold standard, and so I was working through trying to make Nuke look the same as, or Fusion look the same as the results I was getting through Nuke. And I found that to make things so they look exactly the same, you really do want to apply a gamma correction on the ambient occlusion. So we have this output here that we merged before, and we have this output here that we're going to bring it in, and we merge those two together. And again, this is an AO, so you do want to multiply those. So if we go in and we multiply those, we get the output node, and here's our output node. And if we look at this node, and if I go back here and I call up my Photoshop picture, and let me reduce that in size just a little bit. If we look at the two together, you can see that the Photoshop and the Fusion outputs look identical, and we get a similar result. And so by combining things the way that I combined them with Fusion, by using the gamma correction and using a normal blending mode when I work with Fusion, I get the same result as I get when I blended things together with Photoshop. So the last thing we want to look at is Nuke. Okay, back again. Sorry about that. Not sure what it was, but it's all up and working again now. So this is the interface with Nuke. And if we look at a clean Nuke interface, let me hit save so I can come back to this, and I'll just hit new, and we open up a new file for Nuke. This is what the user interface looks like. Fairly similar to what we had with Fusion. At the moment I only have one viewer. You can actually have multiple viewers open. I don't at this point in time. So this is my viewer window. Here's my timeline, and this is my area here for building nodes. In my area on the left is my property sheets. Like I did with Fusion, very first things you want to do with Nuke is you want to set your project up right. So in this case, if you just tap anywhere and you hit S, type the word S, and Nuke will bring up a property sheet for your specific project. Okay, and the thing you want to do is you want to go here and say what's the full size format and what's the frames per second. If you've imported something already, whatever the first file is that you imported will show up here. You can change with once you get more familiar with Nuke, you can change what the default setting is. So if you're always doing projects that are in this case, the default Super 2K, but if you're always doing things in PC video, say 640 by 480, or if you're doing things in NTSC, you can set up a default so it always comes up that way. Let me close this window down. And as you can see, one of the nice things with Nuke is I can have multiple projects open at the same time, all with just one license, which makes things quite nice. So here's the view with Nuke, and we want to bring things in, and the way you bring things in with Nuke is you use a read node and you output with a write node. So if I wanted to read something in, I can go up here and I can say give me a read node, and it brings up a file manager because you're going to do a read. It wants to know what's the file you're going to look at. And so if I went in here and I grabbed this node and I said open, it would bring in that node, and here's that node. And when it brings it in, the attributes for that node come up over here. All right, and so then with that read node in, I have the attributes, and I can put that together. And so if I brought in this node and I wanted to bring in another picture, another thing I can do is I can just hit, in the case of Nuke, I can just hit R, and R defaults to a read node, and I could bring out this file. Let me open that up, bring that in. And so I have these two nodes. And now if I wanted to merge these together, excuse me, I didn't show that in Fusion. I'll go back and show that. But I can go in and I can simply hit M to bring up a merge node. So here's my merge node. Or I can hit delete. I can click on one of these, and if I hit M, it brings up a merge, and it automatically is setting itself up for merging an A node over a B node. And so merge is A over B. So here's the A node is tied to this node here, and here's my B node. I can take that and I just connect it like that, and so here's A over B. Now if I wanted to view what this is, the way this works in Nuke is I've got a viewer. I have viewer 1 or viewer 2 over here, and if I hit 1, it shows viewer 2 and it connects it. Did you see that line that connected right there? And it's showing the output. So this is the output of my merge with these two nodes that I read in. Let me go back to Fusion real quick, because I did not show that. So if I have Fusion, we went in here, and the way that you bring up a merge node is you just go up to the tool here and you click node. If I click on a node and I go up here to merge and click merge, it brings it in and just sticks it in there, okay, and ties it together. If I have nothing selected and I hit a merge node, it just pops in a node. And then the way that you connect things together is you grab the output of a node. Like in this case, if I wanted to connect this to this, I can go in here and actually from here, I grab this output and I go to there, and it connects the two together. So the output goes down here, and the output is also going to this node. If I want to get rid of that node, I can take and just click on that. It goes away. Want to get rid of the node completely, I can hit delete. So let me close this back down. Okay, back here on Nuke, same kind of thing. I can go in here. If I want to get rid of a connection, I can just click on the connection and drag it away. Go over here, click on the connection and drag it away. Click on the connection here, connect it back in. Here, connects it back in. So you can make connections very quickly. When you look at the node, again, here's the attributes, and this is telling you that it's going to do a union at this point in time of A over B. So here's my A channels, and here's my B channels, and here's my output. And so with Nuke, you've got almost infinite control over everything. And I can go in here and so we have A and B, and at this point in time it's doing a union. I could go in and I could do a intersection, union, and here's my blending modes. So here's the operations. So I can go in and there's a multitude of things. I can do a plus. I can go in here and do an out, let me do a minus. Okay, those actually were identical images, so doing a minus gives you nothing. Do a screen. So here's where you set what kind of operation you want when you're working with Nuke. You have a merge node, you go to the operation, and that's how you set what you're doing with that particular node. So if I go through here, and let me put this back to here. The way I brought things in, so I brought in the diffuse node, and I brought in the specular node, and I did a merge. Now in this case, because these files, Nuke knows that PNG files need gamma correction. So I didn't have to gamma correct these, okay? Nuke did that for me because it's smart enough to know that, oh, this is a PNG file. If you're going to merge these together and you want the math to come out correctly, you need to do a gamma correction. I'm going to go ahead and do that for you. So Nuke did that for me. When I was working with Fusion, I had to go in and put this gamma correction node in because Fusion doesn't do that automatically. Nuke does it automatically for you, so you don't have to worry about that operation. And then because it did that operation for me, I can do a plus. And so it adds together and I can do a plus operation. I go in and I get my image-based lighting, I merge those together and I can do a plus. I get my ambient occlusion, I bring that in and I merge that. I go down here with ambient occlusion and we do a multiply. The way I'm getting these property sheets over here is when you select a node, if you double click on it, the property sheet will come up. If you get lots of property sheets, you can see there's a scroll bar over here. You can just delete them. You just click X on there and they delete. In fact, I can clear them all out. You want to get them back, you just pick on whatever node you want, double click on the node, and the node properties will come back up. So we merged everything through, we put it through, now we want to get the file out. So in Nuke, you get a file out by using a write node. In Fusion, you get a file out by using a save node. This is a saver. So if we go right here and click on here, that's a save node. If we go to Tools, go to I/O, we create a saver. So I can create a saver that creates a save node. It says, where do you want to save it? And so on and so forth. I'm going to hit cancel because I don't want to do that. We'll close this back down. And so in Nuke, we have a write node. And you go over here, and when this node comes up, first thing you want to do is go to File and click on the folder. And this says, where is it that you're going to save this file? So you navigate to where you want to save it. And you want to put the dot extension that you're going to be using. So if you're going to be using saving it as a TIFF, you want to put a .TIF there. If you're going to save it as a JPEG, you want to put a .jpg. You want to tell Nuke how you're saving that. What it'll do is pick that up. If you don't put that on there, then you need to be sure and see what the file type is here, okay? Because you need to set that file type. And so because I put the .png in here, Nuke saw that, and so it says the file type is going to be a .png. The color space it's going to gamma correct when it writes the output, so I want it to be a sRGB color space. And so we set the file name, we set the color space, we set the file type, and we've set the data type. I've worked with 8 bits coming in, I want 8 bits going out, and so that's how I have that. And so then if you want to see what that output looks like, then you go to the write node, and right here you just say render. And you say render, and a render tab comes up, and because the file range is just one sequence, it's one file, you just say okay, and it's going to render one file, and it's going to render that output, and it's going to put it right here. On Fusion, if we want to render our output, we do that down here. So you get the output node, and you go down here and you click the render button, and that will render your output. So that's how you get your output. So you put a write node on the end of all of your nodes that you connected together. You hit render and you get your output. On Nuke, you have your nodes all connected together. You set your operations, create a write node. You set your file type, your color space, and the file type, go down here and hit render, and you go from there. Both Fusion and Nuke, these have timelines. And both programs are smart enough to know that instead of, if I brought in just one single file, I brought in a sequence of images, then when you did render, it would do these operations for each of the images in the folders that were the sequence of images that you were working with. So if you had 1,000 files or 1,000 frames, it would do this operation for all 1,000 frames and would write them out to a folder, and you'd have 1,000 output frames. In CGI, this is typically what we do. You don't write to a movie file, you write to a sequence of images. So that when you save it, later you can composite that to a movie, but very often you'll do something and you need to change frames 120 through 150. Well, you don't want to have to rerun. If you rendered it as a movie, you'd have to re-render the whole thing. Because you render it as a sequence of images, you just need to render those frames out that changed, and everything else stays the same. So you can go back in with your compositor, put that together, just render out the frames that changed, put it back together, and you're good to go and make the whole movie, and you didn't have to render everything all together. So that's the big advantage, another big advantage of rendering out in frames. And the same goes for using After Effects as well as Fusion or Nuke. Photoshop really, at least to my knowledge, doesn't have the ability to render out movies as sequences of images. Now maybe it does, and I'm just not aware of that, but to my knowledge it doesn't do that. So that's, if you're just compositing a single frame, Photoshop is not bad. If you're compositing a movie, you at a minimum really want to use After Effects. I would really though recommend getting the free versions of either Nuke and or Fusion and compositing with that. So this has been Phil with Phil Effects. Thanks a lot. Catch you later.